What's up, Ken from Palm Beach Dyno here. I do a lot of these videos where I show you dyno graphs and I try to give you little hints and tips on how to read these things on each video, but I decided to do an entire video just on how the dyno measures the horsepower and then also how to interpret the graph. This is really a precursor to another video I plan on doing, which is about getting the maximum performance out of your vehicle, maximum acceleration, drag strip, wide open throttle type performance. And in that video, we will discuss horsepower versus torque and which is better, or there is no which is better. Obviously, it depends on what you're using it for. But before we get to any of that, we got to talk about dynos. So the very first dyno that we're going to talk about is probably what most people would consider the most popular, widespread dyno. The dyno when comparing numbers is used most frequently, and there's a reason for that, but let's go over it one by one. The first one is the Dynojet. This is a 224X. I bought my first Dynojet in 2004. It was this exact model. It was actually when this first just came out. They used to have a larger drum model, which is 48 inch. This is a 24-inch drum, and it's a very simple machine, really. It's a known weight drum, which has to be calibrated in the software, but this is done by Dynojet. You can't go in there and change that, and that's important. So really, there's no end user calibration on a device like this. There is a version of this dyno that adds an eddy brake. It's this dyno, and you can add to it, but we're not going to talk about that in this video. We're going to talk about the inertia version of this dyno. Right here, this is a very simple air brake. There's two large brake pads under here, and it's air actuated, and it acts on the drum right there. It's a very basic machine. It's a heavy drum. Right behind here, there's a speed sensor. It measures the acceleration rate of the drum, and it gives you the horsepower based off that. Now, that's the important part to remember. The two main dynos we're going to talk about, which is inertia and a load dyno, measure horsepower and torque very differently. In fact, this dyno measures the horsepower and then will calculate torque based on the horsepower and RPM, because those are the inputs. If you have two of those and you need the third one, it's easy to calculate. So to calculate torque from horsepower, it's horsepower times 5250 divided by RPM. 5250 is an important number. We'll talk about that later. You're always going to see horsepower and torque cross on a dyno graph at 5250, except for one instance, and that has nothing to do with the way the car's making power. It has to do with how you set the dyno graph up. So this dyno measures horsepower based on acceleration rate and calculates torque, and it needs the RPM input. And RPM input is another important thing I'm going to discuss a little bit later on, where errors can get induced into your dyno results without you really knowing about it. So that's a Dynojet. The very next dyno, I believe this is a Mustang dyno. This is a load dyno, and these are eddy current brakes, or eddy brakes. They're basically an electronic brake. So how does this work? Well, this works the exact opposite of a Dynojet. Rather than measuring acceleration rate based on drum speed, it's going to use what's called a load cell that physically measures torque. Okay, and then once you have the torque and RPM, you can calculate the horsepower from that torque. Horsepower equals torque times RPM divided by 5250. So how does this actually measure the torque, though? That's the big question. It uses this device right here. This is a load cell. Let me zoom in a little bit so you can see it better. And this isn't used just on dynos. It could be used for all sorts of things. I mean, theoretically, or however you want to look at it, it's kind of like a scale, right? And scales need to be calibrated, and so do load cells. And that's when we're talking about repeatability and accurate dyno numbers. This is a major factor in that discussion, okay? Let's talk about in a perfect world. You take this dyno, you properly calibrate it, we throw a car on the dyno and dyno it, I'd say that's going to be very accurate, okay? You take a Dynojet, you throw it on the dyno, and that's going to give you a number. Now, people are going to argue that a Dynojet gives higher numbers than a Mustang dyno, which we'll use Mustang dyno for load dynos, all load dynos. we can group together, but we're going to be talking about Mustang. Is that true? It's probably true. Dynojet may be slightly higher, but the reason that I choose Dynojet for my business, I've had 3 Dynojets total, is because of the repeatability of it. The repeatability is more important to me than anything. And that's because of the specific type of business that I run here, which is a mostly stock computer-based tuning business. Now, there are instances where an inertia Dynojet really doesn't suit me very well, and there's been multiple cars that I've tuned over the 15 years really that I couldn't tune on a regular 224 dyno, which is my own car is a good example. I can get it close. Jimmy Cacoletris's the first 6R80 and the 7s, that car never saw over 900 horsepower on this dyno, and that's because at a certain point, remember the Dynojet is just a fixed weight drum, so as horsepower goes up, the pull is going to get quicker and quicker. And now in the real world, obviously, that's going to happen too. If you're in 4th gear and you do a pull at 300 horsepower on the street from 3,000 to redline versus 1,200 horsepower, it's going to go quicker. But the problem is the Dynojet roller isn't as heavy as a car, and once you get up into that really high horsepower range, specifically on turbo cars are a bigger problem because of loading the turbos correctly and things like that. So really what it comes down to is on an inertia dyno, it pretty much covers most vehicles that you're going to see at a shop. It works well for most people. If you're a place that specializes in mostly standalone type tuning where we're map based and you need to hit different cells on a table, it makes it a little bit more difficult. But when you're tuning mostly mass air cars, factory cars, cars where the tunes are very repeatable and we get to the point of having a dialed in tune, the repeatability of the numbers are more important to me, because if I know the car should make 600 and it makes 550, quite honestly, every time I've done that, say on like a remote tune and the shop has a Mustang dyno, everyone, including the shop owner himself, instantly starts questioning the calibration of the dyno, and then they get into calibrating the dyno and all that and checking to see if that's it. I don't have to worry about that on a Dynojet, and that's the key. The other key point on a Dynojet is because it's not calibratable, I get very consistent results across the world on a Dynojet, as long as there's a few things that can throw the numbers off for sure, and we're going to get into that. The most important thing is that the low dyno needs calibration. So if you do not calibrate it correctly by mistake, your numbers are going to be off. But it also leaves the door open for some dishonest numbers from your dyno operator. They can calibrate it wrong to read super low on your before numbers, change the calibration, read high, and like nothing's changed, things like that. Now, are most people doing that? I sure hope not, but I guarantee some people are doing it. The other real big important thing we have to, there's two places to introduce a major error, even on a Dynojet and on a Mustang dyno. One is very important, is weather correction, okay? All these dynos are set up for weather correction. So you pretty much have to have that to make it useful. And what is weather correction? So the Dynojet, well, let's bring up a Dyno Graph real quick. That's what this is about. So we're going to use this graph right here to start. This is a 2014 GT500, built engine, cams, runs on 100 octane fuel, regular gasoline, not E85, 808, 781, awesome looking Dyno Graph. So it says right here 808. Did it really make 808 at the wheels? No, because these are corrected numbers. Now, how much did it really make? Well, it made about 3% less, because here I have it up that you can see the correction factor, which I'm using STD correction. Now, there's two different correction factors when you're talking about weather correction on a dyno, or there's more than that, but two common ones, SAE and STD. This is a very sticky topic for me because in the past, I've always used SAE numbers, and I feel those are like probably, when you're talking about accuracy, there's so many different factors involved on getting the dyno number, but everything being perfect, SAE numbers may be a little bit more accurate, but quite honestly, I started using STD numbers because a lot of other people are using STD numbers. So if you're out there comparing numbers to other videos and other vendors and all that, you know, I have to use STD numbers to be competitive. I mean, unfortunately, that's just how this goes. What I can do, though, for those of you that really want to see SAE numbers, is from now on all future videos, I'll try my best to put both STD numbers and SAE numbers. Now, generally, there's a few percent difference. We'll look at these in SAE. How about that? So they make it a little bit more difficult to switch between the two than they used to. Let me do that real quick. Well, first we'll do uncorrected. So uncorrected is the actual numbers the car put down on the dyno measured, okay? So we're at 781 horsepower and 755 foot-pounds of torque. So that's what it measured, raw numbers. If we were to dyno this car, and as you can see, it was 96 degrees in here when we did that. That's one thing about South Florida. And another reason I use STD numbers is weather correction will correct for weather. It doesn't do as good of a job correcting for the humidity component, and we deal with that heavily down here. So another reason I use STD. So anyway, so this is uncorrected, 781, 755. So how does it actually correct for the weather? Well, it applies math to, well, first it comes up with a correction factor based off of the weather conditions, which include temperature, barometric pressure, humidity, and then also actual altitude, which actually doesn't use actual altitude, it's just using the barometric reading as that. So, you know, it's kind of like density altitude when you're racing, right? Density altitude is important to compare numbers with your buddy that lives in Colorado, and so are corrected numbers. Now, there's issues with corrected numbers on turbo cars when you go to altitude. That's a very controversial topic. We're not going to hit on that today. So anyway, so 781 STD. $791 SAE. And 808 STD. So those are the different weather corrections. So again, why is weather correction important? I can take this car and dyno it in this weather condition, use this corrected number, and then he can come back in the middle of winter, which isn't a huge change here, but this applies to people that live up north where there's huge differences in weather. But let's say it's 75 degrees in the winter. The car should put down very similar numbers, and that is why it's valuable, because the Dynojet is very consistent because there's no calibration to it. I don't have to worry about the dyno being miscalibrated. And then I have the weather correction on top of that to help me determine if the car is making more or less power in completely different weather conditions, or for that matter, you know, at different altitudes. Like I said, turbo cars kind of screw up this whole deal, and it has to do with wastegates and how they target boost versus a supercharger, where the pulley is the pulley and it's going to spin the blower at the same deal. The turbo is going to continue to try to make the target boost, and that's why the correction, taking the same setup and going to altitude, is a little misleading. Anyway, so let's get to, there's one other thing that's very important that can induce an error in dyno graphs, and this is another reason why Dynojet is so great. One place that most dynos come up short, or at least that I've noticed talking to other friends with different dynos, is RPM pickup, okay? Dynojet has that figured out pretty well. They have an inductive pickup that goes on the coil or the spark plug wire, and in most cars it works tremendously, okay? So again, remember, RPM is a major component in calculating, in a Dynojet's case, it measures horsepower and it needs RPM to get torque. If you don't have RPM input, you're not even gonna know the torque. So, what's the other way to measure RPM? One of the other very common ways, a Dynojet does do this, and we use this in cases when the inductive pickup isn't working correctly, and why I know it's a problem is roll speed. So what you do is you put the car in the gear that you're going to tune it in, and then you say, you know, I want to lock it in at 3,000 RPM. You set that in the software, hold the car at 3,000 RPM, click a button, and then that samples what's called the gear ratio, and that will calculate RPM based off the math instead of actually measuring. And that works fairly well. If you're very, very accurate with it, it works very well. But on some cars, even if you try to be very accurate, it doesn't because of the tire. The tire is going to change size with speed and power and all those sorts of things. And when that happens, that's going to affect the RPM reading. So what happens is since on this, in this case, the horsepower is always going to be right, but if your RPM is wrong in either direction, your torque could either be artificially higher or lower because it may be shifting your power range down or high. Now the horsepower, when I say the horsepower is going to be right, the shape of the curve will be right, the numbers will be right, but obviously if the RPM's off, the RPM's off. So like for instance, this setup here, if this was using an inductive pickup, but if we used roll speed and it was calculated to read wrong and it only showed this reaching 6,000 RPM as opposed to 6,700 RPM, it would shift everything down, and as you shift everything this way, torque is going to go up. And the same would hold true as if we were wrong in the other direction. Now, again, like I said, on a Dynojet, we use the inductive pickup the majority of the time, so this isn't an issue, but on a lot of other dynos, they're using roll speed, and I've had that problem. It's so common that when I look at a Dyno Graph, I don't even like complain about it. I'm just like, yeah, that's wrong. Because you just know that the RPM is wrong, so then one of your numbers is going to be wrong. So in this case, you know, I guess this is an important point as it compares to the next video I plan on doing, which is how to achieve maximum acceleration with your car, okay? So if your Dyno Graph isn't accurate based on RPM, then everything I'm telling you now and how to use the Dyno Graph to evaluate your performance at the track or determine shift points or all those sorts of things goes out the door. So RPM accuracy is very important in this. Anyway, let's move on to another Dyno Graph here. I want to show you the difference. So a lot of people just go look at this, 808, 781, cool. And then if you go to do another pull, that's all they're looking at. They're not looking at any of this, okay? So what you got to look at the power at, you know, throughout the whole pull. So at 5,500, this thing is still putting out 761 horsepower. At 6,000, it's putting out 787 horsepower. At the top of the pole, 803. Now, why is this important? Because you don't drive the car here. You don't drive the car here. You're driving it throughout the whole thing. So what's really important, and again, I'm going to get into this into great detail, that's why it's going to be its own video, is to figure out the power band you're going to be operating in, and that's based on your shift points and average horsepower. You know, there's going to be tons of people that talk about torque and all that, and again, this is going to be in the other video, but it really comes down to, for maximum acceleration at wide open throttle, it comes down to your horsepower curve. There's so many other factors where torque becomes important when we're talking about street cars and drivability and fun factor and all that. But when we're talking about all-out maximum performance, horsepower and RPM is where it's at, and that's why at the top level of all motorsports, F1, Pro Stock, NASCAR, they're all spinning lots of RPM and they don't make much torque. There's a reason for that. Now that doesn't always apply to a street car, and why it's important to go over the details of this later. So anyway, let's talk about average power. So now this is a GT500, it's making killer power, it's almost square, 808, 781, revving to 6,700. Awesome muscle car. Now, let's throw this graph up. So again, if you're, what I'm going to do is I'm going to shut torque off to make it a little bit easier. In a second I will, to make it a little easier to look at. But this is a Coyote Vortec car, which we just did a video on this car recently, if you want to look back. 1007 and 710 torque. So you go, oh wow, you know, it's close on torque and at 200 horsepower on, you know, at redline or peak power. Let's look at just the horsepower graph to make it easier to look at. Look at that. Wow, that is significantly different. These are very, very, very different cars, obviously. Both stick shift cars, by the way. And this car actually probably would have kept pulling up top. We ran out of fuel, but that's not really the point of this. The point of this is to show you two very different power bands and how they may affect the car. Now, how is this going to feel driving it? Well, I took the torque graph off, but again, you can look at the horsepower is a reflection of torque. So it's got, say at 3,500, this car has 160 more horsepower at 3,500, right? So stoplight to stoplight, tipping into it, just having fun on the street, the red graph is gonna be probably the most fun, by far. Again, this is the 2014 GT500 with the stock blower with some work done to it, and this one here is a Vortec JTB. Now, we don't all just drive stoplight to stoplight and tip into our car and have fun. We race at the drag strip, we race at the road course, we race on the street, some people roll race. Most likely, the blue car would destroy the red car in a roll race. The red car just playing around on the street might leave the blue car sitting still from a stoplight. Most cars that are fully dialed in at the track, they're not going to use any of this, right? Because you got a converter or you're going to dump your clutch up high and you're only going to use high RPM. So for instance, the Coyote is probably going to, once the curve's fixed, is going to shift up around 8,000, and you know, maybe you'll drop down to here, which is almost 900. So he's going to be from say 880 to 1,000 plus the whole way down the track. This car here, if it's just right at 67 and it drops down, you know, to 55 or somewhere in here, maybe even 5,000, you're at 600. So your average is, excuse me, no, that's the Vortec graph, sorry. You're at 700. So at 5,000, you're at 700, and at 67, you're at 808. So, you know, it's a good average, but the average of this car is probably higher, okay? So now, let's look at one more graph. This graph combines the best of both worlds, okay? So what this graph, green graph is, this is a 2018 Whipple car with a Whipple on it, or excuse me, of course it has a Whipple, it's a 2018 Whipple car. 3-liter Gen 5 Whipple, and what do we see here? It's not quite keeping up with the GT500 down low, but it's way closer than the Vortec, yet it destroys the GT500 with RPM. And that is why these 2018 Whipple cars are kicking so much butt, you know, is it gives you the best of both worlds. So here's 3 very different cars that'll perform very differently. This green car, although this is actually off the stock engine. This is Lexi's 2018 Whipple car that's been 160 miles an hour in the quarter mile. It made a little bit more than this, but the power curve is the same, just step it up, more boost. So, you know, really, if you don't understand how to read this graph, you're really not going to understand how to get the most out of your car. And when people talk about, oh, dyno numbers don't matter, then they're you know, why put the car on the dyno then, right? This is very important. I have a calculator on our website that, believe it or not, is very, very accurate as it compares to Dynojet numbers. So you can take your trap speed from the track, put in the weight of your car, and it should spit out a number that's very close to this. And why is that useful? Because, you know, you go to the dyno and you put down 600 rural horsepower, and then you go to the track and you trap 120 miles an hour, well, something's wrong, right? But you may not know that unless you run the numbers. Now, that's a bad example, that's obvious, but there's times where I've taken a car to the track, the trap seemed low, I threw it through my calculator, and I realized, hey, this isn't right. So what's wrong? So then it gives you an opportunity to troubleshoot. If it's a combo that you haven't dealt with, you may not know exactly what it should run. So why not use the data that this is giving you? Of course, you have to factor in, you know, altitude differences and corrected numbers. It's not going to match your corrected numbers unless you're running under similar conditions, but it'll be pretty damn close, you know. So these are all the tools you can use to help get the maximum performance out of your car. And a dyno graph is super important to that. RPM range, and again, the RPM pickup is important if you're going to be using the dyno graph to help determine shift points. Now, everything I'm telling you isn't just cut and dried 100% science. I've determined shift points based off a Dyno Graph, and I've actually come up with different results at the track. There's so many things that factor into that. The clutch setup, the torque converter setup, the stall speed. This blue car, like I said, probably could kill this GT500 even out of the hole if it has the proper torque converter, you know, if it's an automatic car. So, you know, a full out race car, maximum performance, so many little things that come into play there. Don't get discouraged if you take your car out to the track and it doesn't do quite as well as Bob on the internet. Bob may be an expert. Bob may have an expert helping him. Bob may have done things to his car that he's not telling you on Facebook. He may know tricks that he, you know, there's nothing, it's not that he's got a different boost level than he's saying, or he's running a different fuel than he's saying. There may be something small that gives him an advantage at the track. That's why in classes like, say, Coyote stock in the NMRA, people see the performances of that stuff and they don't even believe it because it just doesn't make sense. And how are those guys going so quick? They're going so quick because they've been doing that for a long time. Most of the guys that are successful in that class are long-time racers, champions in other classes, or either that or they have other champions helping them. You know, Coyote stock guys were running 1060s when that class started, 1070s, and you know, there's been rule changes and all that, but they're running 10 teens now. Did they change the engine? No, it's a sealed engine. Did they add boost? No, it's a naturally aspirated class. So where did all that AT come from? That is up to you to answer yourself on your own car. So, you know, well, I'll give you all the tools, but there's all the little details that you're only going to get to by going to the track over and over and over again. The most successful people, if it's on Facebook, NMRA, you know, test and tune champions, they all have a lot of passes on their car, or they have somebody in their corner that has a lot of passes on that same combo. That's not a coincidence. So anyway, thanks for joining us. This video went on too long once again. Join us on the next one on how to achieve maximum acceleration, and you're going to need to watch this video first. So if you just jumped in the middle, rewind and watch it a few more times, and we'll go over all these dyno graphs again when we go over getting the most performance out of these particular combinations. See you next time.